Hello and welcome to this podcast. Today we are going to be talking about the fight or flight system and how it can affect people short term and also long term. And I'm here joined by Mark today. Hello, Mark.
Hello again. Nice to see you again.
You too. So, shall we get into the first question?
Yes, certainly.
So, the first question that I have is, what is the fight or flight system?
So, fight or flight is a protective response by the system. So, probably the best way I explain this is imagine we're walking down the road and a big dog jumps out at us. And at that point, the body pushes us into fight or flight to either deal with that situation or to get out of it. So, we either sort it or we run away. And what physically happens when that goes on is the brain sends electricity along neural pathways into the brain, into the amygdala, to get us to sort that situation out. And that's natural, it's perfectly healthy, and it's meant to be okay. But when anxiety becomes a problem, is that fight or flight system seems to be on either permanently or while something else isn't triggering it. So it could be that we're sitting there watching the telly and suddenly we go into fight or flight and we feel anxious, but there's no real danger there, if that makes sense.
Great. So if the effects are long term, what would be the implications for like the social factors?
Okay, so really, when fight or flight's on it, that's when we're feeling anxious. That's when we've got an anxiety problem. So the social factors could be that we can't get onto trains or buses. It might be for an awful lot of people, they don't like to be in large crowds. We had a client recently who loved to go to the football match, but had to stop because he just couldn't handle those big clouds. So it just means either in social situations of sort of talking to people, it can shut us down. It can just mean that we don't really listen to people. Again, it can affect concentration and mood. And it just means we don't deal with other people quite as well as we normally do.
Yeah, and I suppose if that doesn't get fixed, in quotation marks,
Mhm.
um, I wonder, does that sort of make other anxiety conditions happen like agoraphobia, say, where somebody's not able to cope in large crowded situations?
Certainly. So we do, when people approach us, we always say to them, um, get this sorted as soon as you can because it can develop onto other problems. I'll give you a perfect example. We had a lady, she'd been on our mailing list for about 4 years. So she'd been watching me making all these videos. And when she rang me, she basically told me she hadn't been out the house for 4 months. She was sleeping on the couch. She wasn't making any food. She was living on all processed stuff, where she used to be a very sociable person. And then it got a little bit worse because when she came into the clinic, although I'd done the assessment, she was physically shaking like you wouldn't believe. And I had to really put my foot down. But she'd started with mild anxiety, going from very sociable to then not being able to handle any sort of situation. But thankfully, I just got a message through the other day. She's now out, she's doing things, she's going on holiday, she's cooking food, and that was really affecting her family. So you're talking about how does that affect people socially? Is if somebody's anxious, first of all, it just means that it's difficult to be around these people. You can't do anything right by them. They can be struggling to communicate. They haven't got the motivation to get out, like agoraphobia, or they're not making food and looking after themselves. But the other challenge we've really got to watch, and this is where, excuse me, we're dealing with parents, is that if a parent is anxious, it's much more likely the child's going to be anxious. The doctors call this hereditary anxiety, but it's not. It's just we have an ability to pattern the behavior of other people. And again, what was really funny was quite a few years ago, I had a gentleman came in, um, and he liked his sport, but if anybody was watching, he'd fall to pieces. So if there was nobody there, he could run really fast, but if there was anybody watching, he couldn't do it. And then 3 weeks later, we get a phone call, and this lovely girl comes in, and her mannerisms were exactly the same as this gentleman. And as I came towards the end of the session, I said, "You're not by any chance related to a guy called such and such?" And she said, "Yes, that's my dad." But she kind of developed all that anxiety from somebody else. So yes, socially, we can affect a lot of people around us, and it can stop us from going out and enjoying events, and it causes all sorts of other problems.
That's really interesting. And would you say the sort of the hereditary anxiety that you mentioned before, that the doctors say that it's called that, would
Mhm.
you sort of that say that sort of social influence, sort of like learning off somebody else?
It is. It's so the way that we do it in neurolinguistic programming is we have a natural ability to pattern things around us, or model is another word we could use. So very often, another example is if you take an adopted child and put it into a family, it typically picks up the health conditions of that family, and it's not that it's partly if a family has a bad diet, that child's likely to have a bad diet. So we do this sort of modeling, this sort of patterning thing naturally. And in fact, I saw it years ago. A friend of mine suddenly developed a limp, and there was nothing wrong with the leg. She got it checked, but she just got married to a guy who had a limp from a sports injury, and she picked that up, and she couldn't figure out why that was. She was a physical therapist herself, and I said, "Ah, you're just modeling what your husband's doing." So we've got this really good. We're really clever at the things we learn, but sometimes we learn the negative sides. And yes, certainly we can pick up the anxiety of other people. And you must know what it's like yourself. If ever you've been around somebody who is really anxious or really depressed, they can be really hard work. And that's why we have to take that self care as a therapist, because if we're working with people with problems all day, boy, can that burn you out very quickly.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I've heard some people even develop conditions because of sort of um hearing what's been going on with somebody. So like I don't know. So see if somebody's got like anxiety,
Mhm.
then somebody else who have heard that anxiety, that means I could potentially like sort of what like do the anxiety sort of symptoms at the same time, the same as somebody else, if that makes sense.
Certainly. So there's two sides to look at here. If you go to the doctor and the doctor says you have social anxiety, people then create this identity that that's their illness. And there has been cases in the past where people have had a diagnosis of something, gone and read about it, and then they pull up all the symptoms, to then a couple of years later be told, actually, we made a misdiagnosis and you've now got something else. And all those symptoms disappear, but the new ones come in. And this is one of the reasons why we don't always work on the diagnosis of the NHS, and that we want to see what's going on. So
Yeah.
certainly we've got a really good learning skill where we can pick up these things, but then you get hypochondriacs who just suddenly read something in a book and say, "Ah, I've got this," and they take it on, and and it can be physical symptoms. Something that there's not much credibility to, but I did see an article on it years ago, was people who have multiple personalities in psychiatric hospitals can wake up as different people each day and have different diseases. And there is a claim, I can't verify this, that some people will wake up as John one day with brown eyes and wake up as Paul the next day with blue eyes, and that
Oh,
their eye
wow.
color changes. And I'd love to see some proper evidence on that, but it came from a very credible source. And there was also a case of a lady who woke up as Marie one day and she was English, and then the next day she wakes up as somebody else who was French, and she could only speak French, and she could only eat French food, but she'd never been to France. So the belief in the brain about what we are and who we are, that identity, can be very good, but it's also something we have to work with. Because if I have a client and they believe they're an anxious person, I'm then trying to sort of decrease that belief and create a new one that you're a calm, relaxed person. And that's where hypnotherapy can come in. When we use those direct suggestions under hypnosis, we kind of trance them through the floor, but then hit them with a ton and ton and ton of suggestions. And then magically, somebody who couldn't drive one day is able to sit in the car nice and relaxed and be happy the next.
That's really interesting, and I'm pretty sure I can remember a movie that's on about people who have multiple personalities. And for the life of me, I can't remember what it's called. So if I do remember, I'll let you know. But
Yeah.
it's really interesting because I think it is a true story as well. But it's interesting to sort of watch the movie and like just like see on another person's perspective what it's like. I really like the true life stories as well.
So, digging a little bit deeper into that, there's a couple of different therapies out there. In some cases, we call it parts therapy, in that we believe within each person there are multiple personalities, but I wouldn't mention that to your doctor. And that we have these different personalities which have different resource states. So, it is interesting that sometimes they can be negative. If somebody has an addiction, this sounds really weird, but we can sit down with a person and I'll say to them, okay, so the part of you that makes you want to drink, what do they look like? What is their name? And then I would actually give therapy to that part of them. I would pull that part forward and give therapy to that one. And then I'll look around and see if there's any others. And that sounds absolutely crazy, but it works really well. So it's as though we've got all these multiple personalities and we have to give therapy to all of these. But it also works on a good level in that quite often we have different resource states. So when I was doing my NLP training all those years ago, I had to bring up a time where I had a hell of a problem and I managed to sort it out. And it was really funny. The guys talked me through it, but I didn't realize that I went through a process of I would stamp my foot, blow out air, and then say, right, let's get this sorted. And once you become aware of those different states, you can then go on and use these. And this is something we do. We find the answer within each person. But there are, you'll know it, there's been some days when you've done things really, really well and handled problems. And then other days you've been in a right mood and the slightest little thing sets you off. And it's learning to switch on and off the personalities that do these sort of things.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And do you think that sort of goes in line of, say, you're a different person going to work, for example, or you're a different person going with your friends and stuff like that? Does that tend to fit into that multiple anxiety, not multiple anxiety, multiple personality state?
Yes, yeah, it's just so first of all, Sunday evening for a lot of people, they start to get a bit down because they know they've got to go back to work tomorrow. If somebody doesn't like the job, I'm really fired up. I've got some great clients tomorrow, so I'm looking forward to getting in there and making the differences. But we do a very similar thing to parts of something called ego states therapy, where they believe if you imagine we've got a house with a basement, that one of those personalities is in the living room controlling everything, and all the other little people are in the basement. And then something can happen and that changes around where a different person comes on. So going back to addicts, I had a client a while ago, and I said, "What's the personality that makes you drink?" And it was like a little LOL doll with great big eyes that always had a bottle of wine in his hand, and he called this alky. But then when I searched, there were other personalities that were really about health and fitness. And we brought those up and we just taught this guy how to get rid of alky and bring the health and fitness personality in, and it worked really nicely.
That seems really interesting. So, going back to the fight or flight, what sort of environmental factors are there for if you have long-term fight or flight?
So, when we get into that anxious state, we can become very oversensitive to noise. It's quite common that people don't like the sound of children running around. They don't like the sound of crowds. So, again, football matches might be a trigger. It might be certain types of weather. It is funny that people become much more sensitive to rain and wind and cold. So, it means that when they're going out and they're in that state, they struggle with certain situations. And one of the biggest ones is when people get anxious, they struggle to go out and meet their friends and go to the bar or have a meal. In fact, after lockdown, that was something we saw massively, and that we'd spent all this time keeping away from everybody else and staying indoors. And then suddenly you were allowed to go back out and have a meal, and people were having panic attacks because there was waiters coming up to them who could have all sorts of colds and germs, and other people moving around, and it was just it really reprogrammed us lockdown, and that we went in one sort of behavior, and then when we came out of it, we're still seeing problems from lockdown as people became very, very scared to be out and noticing the environment an awful lot more.
Oh yeah, definitely. And do you think with the weather, in the fight or flight system, do you think that people aren't able to regulate the bo body temperature? So like if it's cold, they get like really hot all of a sudden and vice versa.
So one of the things we do see with anxiety is people seem to have sort of hot flashes. That's one of the symptoms where we start to sweat, perspire. But definitely because we become a lot more sensitive, it's mainly I see to the cold. But then I've seen a few clients as well over the years who just do not like hot weather. They're just that sun comes out, and usually the sun's quite a healing, relaxing sort of situation. But they just become oversensitive to anything. So it can be wind, rain, sun, and be people around them, the noise of children, people who are afraid of dogs. There's so much naturally in fight or flight that is a protection system to keep us safe. But then we get to the point where we're seeing everything as a threat.
That makes sense, and it is really interesting how it can affect someone so massively as well. Um, so what about like the biological factors within the fight or flight system when it's long term?
So we know that biologically, when we go into fight or flight or the anxiety mode, the brain's firing electricity along neural pathways into the amygdala, which puts us on high alert. However, there's some downsides to long-term anxiety. One is it really takes the immune system down. We're much more likely to get coughs and colds and cancers if we're constantly in a state of fight or flight or anxiety. It also kind of burns out the digestive system, and that when we're stressed, which is a type of anxiety, the digestive system doesn't work as well. And then the problem with that is we're not absorbing the nutrients from food. And if that's not feeding the brain and the rest of the body, we get more health issues. It can make us feel very weak. Now, this is really weird. When we get anxious, some people just feel like they don't have the strength anymore. They become very tired. So it can affect that. And we do see that in sports psychology. There was a lovely story about Andre Agassi years ago, you probably haven't heard of, who was quite a famous tennis player. But he was up and down in his performance, and he went to a famous NLP hypnosis person, and they just said to him, I just want video footage of you walking onto the court. And he could predict just from the first minute whether he played well or played badly. And what they found was in his brain, if he was going on and he was confident, he would say, I own this guy. I'm going to thrash this guy. And he would play really well. But if he was anxious, if he believed this guy was going to beat him, he just kind of gave up before he'd even got on the court. So again, the thoughts that we have running in our head, which are usually unconscious, are enough to trigger anxiety and fight or flight. So physically, it can make such a difference on the body, and that's why there's so much money in sports psychology. In fact, I've had loads of clients who suddenly can't do as well on the golf course, and I've just got to examine what's going on in the head and then teach them how to do that.
That seems really interesting. And so have you seen like people who have um bad anxiety and they're struggling to cope? Have you seen them specifically go to certain like bad foods like processed foods or sugar or anything like that that don't turn to like healthier foods like fruit and veg?
Yes, certainly. So whenever we feel down, and it's not just with anxiety, so let's say you wake up and you've got a horrible cold, you're much less likely to go and make those healthy foods. So your meal prep goes out the window, and meal prep's one of the first steps always of having a healthy diet. And then you just want to grab something quick. It's the chocolates, the sugar, the fat, the salt. So we see this all the time. And when people get anxious, it's just they try and eat their way out of those feelings. And this is why people eat so much junk when they're anxious. And again, that's got a knock-on effect of a lack of nutrients. We're not feeding the brain properly. but it's certainly a big thing. In fact, that lady I was telling you about before, she just kind of lived on the couch and just, even though she used to own a business that made food, she just couldn't be bothered to cook. And of
Yeah.
course, that had a massive negative effect on her.
Yeah, and I suppose that sort of falls into binge eating as well.
Well, again, yeah, quite often we use food to try and change our mood, but then binge eating can be linked to that, but it can also be a whole set of other problems in its own right. And this is interesting because even today I've had a phone call to say, can you help a family member who's got an eating disorder? And at that point, I say, right, now I need to know, is anxiety involved or is the depression? Because I can sort the eating disorder out, but if we don't resolve the anxiety, the depression, the stress, it's not going to last very long. So it's
Yeah.
kind of a big ball of all sorts of different things.
Yeah, and then going back to what you said before about how there's sort of like different personalities of you. I've sort of learned that to somebody that I watch on Instagram who has ARFID, like spelled ARFID. It's a specific type of eating disorder, and she sort of calls it a certain name. I can't remember what she calls it, but there's sort of her side of what she wants to eat, but the eating disorder is telling her not to eat because there's three types of ARFID or four, can't remember. Is it three?
I don't know
I'm
exactly.
leaning more towards the three. Anyway, so basically, she calls it like a certain name, and basically she's saying ARFID's not telling us not to eat this, but I'm gonna try it anyway because to sort of like fight it off because she's gone through like therapy and ways how to cope in that sort of situation. And I find that really interesting as well with how there's like sort of a personality state that you sort of putting it towards, and like there's different p people in yourself as well, and you sort of got to like fight that but also have the tools to fight that.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the tools I use, and I wasn't actually trained to do this, but it's amazing how you do your training and you pull your own ideas up, is I kind of have if you imagine I've got a clock face, an old-fashioned clock face in my head. And on each number, there's a different one of my friends or mentors or tutors or trainers on there, including my parents. So at 12 o'clock, I might have my mother. And at 1 o'clock, I might have my dad. But at 3 o'clock, I might have one of my trainers. Is whenever I get a problem and I don't know how to solve it, I'll spin that clock face around to maybe to my mother and say, how would you deal with that situation? And then I might move to number three and go to one of my trainers and say, what would you do this? And this gives me like a dozen different opinions on how to solve a problem. And it's
Ah,
just, and
mm.
so with somebody with an eating disorder, I would say, imagine there's the healthy version of you at 1 o'clock and the unhealthy version of you at 9 o'clock. Which one do you want to choose? What would the 1 o'clock version of you say compared to the 9 o'clock version? And at this thing, then it's not like a stuck behavior, it's they've got a choice. And they say, oh, well, the healthy version of me will tell me to add some salad and some cucumber to the meal, where the 9 o'clock version of me will tell me to devour a whole bar of chocolate. And sometimes just by giving people that little break in time and the choices, it makes a big difference. And when people have choices, they feel a bit more in control, which is something everybody wants. But usually when we've got problems, we feel we're out of control.
Would you say somebody could also use that in the fight or flight system with the clock face and sort of say like, I don't know, the 12 o'clock is the non-anxious version of me where I can be sociable and everything, but the 9 o'clock is the anxious version of me and we don't want to go out and sort of like meet it in the middle.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, with that sort of thing, I would go through with a client of what are the skills, what are the abilities, where have you managed to handle this before? Because in NLP, we believe that the answer is always within the client anyway. And we'd say, okay, which version of you could you use best to handle this situation? And the other thing we do is we teach them some skills and abilities so that they don't have just one way to deal with it. They might have a dozen. So they could either pick a tool or they can pick a personality.
That's really interesting. So, what are the sort of differences between long-term and short-term fight or flight system, and sort of what sort of the biological factors of that?
Um, so again, short term is something that happens, short term. It could just be a few minutes or it could be an hour, and we can usually recover from that nicely. But if we've got that problem long term, again, it speeds up the aging process, it messes up the immune system, it changes the digestive system. And this is why it's important people need to reach out and get some help when they've got an anxiety issue. The other challenge with it with long term is that it really affects sleep and relaxation. And if we don't get enough sleep, we feel more and more anxious. We're in fight or flight more often. And that can cause a whole bigger range of things. And it can get to the point, sadly, that some people become so bad with their anxiety is that we can't help them. It gets to the point where really medication is the only thing that can help. And my view is medication just manages people. It doesn't fix it. It's putting that sticking plaster over. So yeah, it's learning whatever tools you can to take that anxiety down and start to feel relaxed.
Yeah, there is also the approach of the medication with the therapy as well. Do you do that as well, or
We're not qualified at all to deal with medication. The
okay?
When anybody asks me about medication, any client, it's always go back to your GP. We do see an awful lot of clients who come in and as they start to feel better, they drop the medication down and they stop it. And legally, we have to give the information to go back to your GP because stopping a medication dramatically can cause a whole load of other problems. The other challenge is we have seen some clients who are so medicated that our therapy doesn't work for them. Actually,
Yeah.
that hasn't happened for a long, long time. But when I first got into therapy, I remember a nurse came in. She was an hour late, and you would think that she didn't look drunk, but you could see she was on something. And I had to get in touch with the doctor and say, this lady should not be driving, and I don't think she should be working in a hospital when she's so zoned out of her head on medication. But medication changes things massively. For most people, if it's low doses, they're absolutely fine. But it is crazy. I mean, sometimes people take way more medication than they should do just to mask those feelings of anxiety. But it's not my way of dealing with it.
Definitely. Yeah, 100% agree with that. So you've mentioned a little bit about the unconscious and conscious mind. I would like to talk about this a little bit more.
Yeah. Okay. So really, the unconscious mind and the conscious mind is just a model. It's our way of explaining what it is. So the conscious mind, we believe in NLP, roughly knows about seven things, plus or minus two. So if I suddenly say to you, notice the feeling at the end of your big toe, you've consciously become aware of something you weren't aware of. And then if I said, just notice what your ears feel like, you've brought another one on, but you've probably dropped another one off. And the conscious thing is kind of, it's the thing that we're aware of. It's a smaller amount of information, but it can just be we're on the bus and we're noticing people and all of these sort of things. But the unconscious mind, we believe, is thousands and thousands of times bigger. And this is the sort of thing that keeps us sitting upright and not falling over. It's keeping our temperature right. It's keeping our heart beating. And it's automatic. And it is interesting that one of the things I kind of believe is that hypnotically, when we go into a hypnotic trance, we do an awful lot of things that we're not aware of. And some people believe that we're always in one hypnotic state or another, and that we're constantly going. So, a good example is brushing your teeth in the morning. You can get up in the morning, you go in the bathroom, you start to brush your teeth. You're not thinking about brushing your teeth, you just do it automatically, but you might be thinking about something that's going to happen at work. Now, when we learned to brush our teeth, it was quite difficult. And if you want to have fun with this, try and do it with the other hand because you'll be lucky if you can do 30 seconds. It will hurt like crazy, and there's typically blood involved. So doing it with your dominant hand is kind of a hypnotic and unconscious way of doing it. But when you do it with the other hand, it's a conscious process. Now, I would say that anxiety or fight or flight is an unconscious process. We don't choose to do it, but in order to have anxiety, we have to do anxiety. We're physically running this pattern in the brain, and we do that unconsciously. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I tried the brushing your teeth thing with the non-dominant hand just because I'm really interested in like how the brain works and everything. And it is really interesting if you do try it. And you like sort of like have the urge to go back to your dominant hand straight away. And it's really interesting. Um, so with the fight or flight system, could you explain how the sleep and concentration can be affected?
So, one of the biggest symptoms of fight or flight or anxiety is concentration. Um, we think that's because it changes the brain chemistry. But the idea is we struggle to focus. There's that much going on. We could be thinking about lots of different things. And again, it can also mess up how we absorb our food nutrients, how the brain's working. Is that regularly with clients, that concentration, that focus is messed up quite a lot. But then also because we're anxious all the time, there's lots of adrenaline and there's lots of cortisol, and that messes up our sleep. And quite often, as a symptom of anxiety, is we're worrying about things or overthinking. And quite often for us, we see that as it's linked to a digestive issue. Is that for some reason the gut's not working properly, which is very common with anxiety, and it causes a lot of this overthinking or worry. And usually, when we get that health test done for people, and that tells us what's going on when we get the vitamins and minerals and everything sorted. But that then causes lots of other problems in that if we don't get a good night's sleep, we're much more likely to be stressed or anxious the next day. So there's lots and lots of things that can be going on to disrupt the sleep when it comes to anxiety. Excuse me a second, my phone just will not stop going off. Sorry about that.
Okay.
So yeah, sleep's a big, big thing with anxiety and fight or flight. And again, this is just another symptom that we need to sort that out.
Yeah, and I suppose that sort of links with the unconscious and conscious mind again, with the concentration and sleep. Sorry, my Alexa's just gone off there. Um, Everything's happening at once. And I suppose that sort of linked with the sleep and concentration again with the unconscious and conscious mind, depending on what you're thinking about. If it's like the mundane sort of thing, like you go to work every day, but all of a sudden, oh my goodness, I'm gonna get observed. What am I gonna do? That sort of anxiety kicks in then at the night time when you're typically not thinking about something.
Now that's interesting because there's two different words we can use for that. One is catastrophizing, and the other one is future pacing. In that we think about a situation and we kind of worry about all the things that could go wrong. And not trying to get too woo-woo, there's an awful lot of religions believe on this intention really does work. Now we know that when we do that, we change the body physically, but a lot of people claim that the universe changes depending on how woo you want to get with this. But yes, if we catastrophize that I'm going to do this and I'm going to mess up, we're much more likely to do that. However, you can turn that around into a really good tool in that if somebody's terrified of public speaking, which is a huge thing, if you then see yourself going and doing that and you do it well and you're going to interact with the crowd nicely, you're going to be much more relaxed. So, in that sort of situation, you could say to yourself, what tools have I got or what past events have I done this right? And you can model that. Or you come to somebody like me who can teach you how to stand up and how to publicly speak from somebody who used to have a bad stammer and now loves public speaking. So that can either be a negative if we use it to look at the negatives that could happen, but if we do it the other way to do the positive, it works really well. But you'll know how powerful that is. Yes, if you think you're getting observed for the day, that can put the fear of God into people. And in fact, that's the same with exams. In fact, I remember years ago, I had a serious maths exam and I absolutely messed it up because I was so stressed out and nervous of it. And then I had to take a resit about a month later, and I forgot about the exam, and I ended up in the pub. And one of the lads suddenly said, "Aren't you meant to be in an exam in half an hour?" And I'd had 3 pints, and I went back and did that exam, half cut, and I got 95%.
Oh
And then
wow.
and then got really told off by the lecturer to say, "How come you've gone from 30% to 90 odd percent?" And I just said it was stress and nerves.
Yeah,
So,
definitely. It does play a massive part. And if somebody hasn't gone through the situation before, I don't know, like public speaking, for example, not many people do it, but it's only an example I can think of. But if somebody goes through that situation and they haven't done it before, this is their first time, could they, before that,
mhm.
visualize the situation but make it sort of positive? So, like, picture yourself in a conference and like talking and interacting with the crowd really good. Would then that make somebody have a positive feedback in the real life situation?
Yeah, yeah. So quite often when because we deal with a lot of business people who've built a business, done really well, they win an award, and they have to go and get a speech, give a speech, and they're absolutely terrified. And it's just changing what's going on in their head, what they're thinking about. So typically what I do is I'd sit down with that business person and I would teach them some really good communication tools of how to stand up, how to have the posture, to be thinking of something nice. But then also, if they've got tools of how they know how to walk up onto that stage, how to smile at the crowd, how to get some interaction rather than just banging out material, if you start to ask questions, you can warm the crowd up and get them laughing and smiling. And in effect, you become the person who's in control of that rather than the person who's standing there absolutely terrified. And one of the things in life is we don't teach people how to speak publicly. You just suddenly pushed up there and you speak, but you don't have any skills. So if somebody's been taught how to stand up and how to speak and how to engage with the crowd, they then got skills. And when you've got skills and you're prepared, it makes the job so much easier. And
Definitely.
again, it's what's going on in the head. So they could the night before just be sitting there and noticing, I want to visualize I'm going to stand up there, I'm going to give the best presentation, I'm going to ask questions, I'm going to smile at the crowd. And the other way you can do it is you can model somebody else who's good at public speaking. You can sit on YouTube and watch some people speak and find people that you like that do well, and then you can model that. So there's
Definitely.
various aspects to that, but if you're thinking you're going to do awful with it, you're most likely going to.
Oh yeah, and I've sort of like tested it with myself as well. So in an exam situation, don't worry, this was a practice one. So in the real life one, I wouldn't have done that. But I haven't, I sort of said to myself, I'm gonna do really well. I'm gonna
Mhm.
do so good, and this is gonna be an amazing exam. Blah 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 blah. This that, and the other. And I went in, and I ended up getting a really good grade. Vice versa, I went into another fake exam, and this was another test paper that we
Mhm.
were just practicing before the actual exam. And I sort of said to myself the opposite things like, oh, this is gonna be awful. Oh my goodness. And I was getting myself all stressed out about it. And sort of talking myself into different situations and sort of seeing if that made a difference. And I ended up getting a really bad grade. So it does happen.
Well, I'll tell you a good one that I learned from my dad. So my dad grew up in a poor area of the Northeast, was forced out of the home. I think he was about 14 or 15. So he didn't have much education. But he would, believe it or not, he went off and he joined a monastery that were into psychiatric nursing. And he learned to get skills. But then when he came out of that, he really struggled. He said to me, he really struggled with public speaking and doing job interviews. And what he used to do is he used to apply for every job he could see under the sun, not to go for the job, but to get the experience of doing lots of job interviews. And he got so cocky with it that he'd even go in and he'd stop them dead and say, if I took on this job, what are we going to do about this? And what are we going to do? And he blew these people away because he didn't follow the regular routine. But then when two jobs came up that he really wanted, he'd had so much experience of interviews that he absolutely walked it. And it's kind of putting yourself in those situations and you think about how can we do it a little bit better. And another little tip that I teach to all of my clients is I get them to sit and reflect on how the day has gone. And the first thing I say to them is, what is it has gone right? Notice what you've done that day, what you've done right, and give yourself a mental pat on the back. But that way you become aware of what things you've done right and what skills and abilities you've used. But the next bit is the one where you really learn, is that if you sit there and you say, what hasn't gone quite so well today, and then how could I do that better in the future? You then take a problem and you problem solve. And the next time that comes up, you're ready to do it. Now, it sounds incredibly simple, but if you do that for 30 days, the learning curve is massive.
I
So you
suppose
might,
that fits into the thing of you live and learn sort of
mm,
like, would you call it a quote? Possibly. Yeah.
you live and learn, or what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yeah.
Um,
That's a song.
but if you just stop and contemplate, and I'm a little bit OCD with this, is I sit down for about 5 minutes after each client, and it's just what could I've done better? What else could I do? And I'm purposely looking for what I didn't do quite so well, but then I can use that next time and next time. And the thing is, from every client I see, I learn. Even though I've been doing this for 10 years now, I still learn every single day and find new things and get excited about that. And that's what I see as a good therapist. But anybody can do that in life. You can look back at your day, notice what went well and what didn't, and then what can you learn from that? And 30 days of that is a massive amount of learning.
I'm gonna try that myself. And as we talk, um, I've sort of thought about this more and more, and I thought about classical and operant conditioning. This sounds a lot like Pavlov's dogs. And I don't know if you've heard about this, and it's a very no people know about this study in psychology, and like I'll be surprised if you don't know, but
Hmm.
it's really interesting to sort of I know it's dogs, but it sort of links with the
Hmm.
fight or flight system and stuff like that because if the viewers don't know about it, it's basically in summary where Pavlov used these dogs to sort of have a bell and sort of you noticed every time he brought out food, the dog salivated, and when the bell was ringing, that was when the dogs were eating. But then the dogs made an assumption that every time the bell rang, food was going to be like coming soon.
That's
So
right.
he's got the bell ringing, and after that, the dogs come running down and automatically assume that there's food. And I find that really interesting as well.
And it's very, so this is how quickly we can learn, but it can also be quite funny as you can use this. If you're nice and young, but once you have children, if you have children, it's amazing how you can condition them. And it can be certain little triggers that trigger them or us off with all sorts of things. So a great example is if a child's in a supermarket and sees a toy, if you buy them that toy every time they see it, they then expect they're going to get that toy. And then when we, for the first time, say we're not going to, wow, some of the tantrums we can see. So it's learning that there's a lot of conditioning out there, but it's done to the public in every single advert that we see. So there's a famous chocolate. I purposely try and avoid TV with adverts. But there's a certain brand of chocolate bar, and I was shocked. We watched something on Channel 4 that had an advert, and it was basically there was the little girl, she must have been 3 or 4, with her mum outside of a corner shop. And I think it had something like Happy Mother's Day in the window. And she goes in with some buttons and a few coins to get this bar of chocolate. And the shopkeeper gives it to her for cheap. And the emotional manipulation that was in there was criminal in my mind. But that conditions people, exactly like Pavlov's dog, that when it's coming to Mother's Day, you give them something fatty and sugary that's going to make them bigger that probably they don't want. But that we're then told that is a way of showing love. And that same company have done that with repeatedly with adverts. The other one is people say, I know it's Christmas when I say that Coca-Cola truck coming in. And they've manipulated things so much that Santa originally was in green, but they changed it to red.
Oh,
And you've got to then reflect at the end of your day and say, how much of my behavior was triggered by something else?
yeah, and it works sort of works the same way as in schools. I never viewed a school like this until I got told that this, and I can't stop thinking about it now. With how it's mainly in the high schools. I'm not sure if it's in primary schools the same way. I can't remember, but in high school, after like there's like change in lessons, and every time there's a change of lesson, there's a noise like I don't know, an alarm or a bell or whatever the school has put in place. And it sort of makes the classical conditioning work as if to say, right, change of class, or it's break time, or it's end of lunch. And there used to be a warning bell and then a bell that you should be in class.
Mm.
And I've never viewed that the same way as I have since I've learned that. And I was like, that makes total sense now. That's why they do it. And
Mm.
you sort of view things differently once you hear about like different things. And it's really interesting actually how there's certain studies that can be applied in various situations.
Yeah, I think one of the big things I got when I started to do my NLP qualifications properly was understanding how much of me was unconsciously happening, why I was doing this and why I was doing that. And we spent a lot of time learning why. In fact, I remember there was a lady I worked with, and she could not go swimming. She could not get in a swimming pool. There was always it was too dirty. She didn't like the changing rooms. It was too cold. And I remember working with her, and it was just we went back, and it was just somebody had said to her, teacher, "You cannot swim," and that command has then led to a life of habits of not being able to go in the swimming pool. And it's the same in schools in that we tell children no so many million times that they lose all faith in their abilities to do things. And then one of the things that really opened my eyes was I met a load of people who home educated children. And these kids were 3 or 4 years more advanced than the ones that go through the regular system. Because unlike the school that was managing them, they were taught how to think and how to learn. They weren't taught what to think, they were taught how. And it's quite different when you educate somebody from that perspective. But then to see those children 3 or 4 years taking their exams earlier is absolutely shocking. But we have the problem with big schools is you have an awful lot of children now and you have to manage them. Otherwise, it's absolute chaos. But I don't necessarily agree with the way they do it. And we do see an awful lot of children who have meltdowns when they go from their cozy little primary school up into the high schools or the colleges now. In fact, one of the things when I left school, I did really badly at school. But when I went to Newcastle College and they taught us like adults instead of children, that was a very different situation.
Oh, definitely. And I've noticed a massive difference because I went to a sixth form school. So there was still in place that sort of like school vibes and sort of like, yes, there wasn't like strict rules that you have to follow. Yes, there was rules, but you were sort of like implanted by then, like how to go on. And so
Mm.
you're older by then, it's like 16 to 18. So you used to like sort of acting the way in school. So I've noticed a massive difference between school and university
Hmm.
and how so much is independent work and you can just do it at your own time and there's only implications if you don't do it at all. Um, if you don't submit your work in time and if you don't have a logical explanation why you haven't submitted the
Yeah.
work, it can lead to like awful circumstances. You could even be like from your course. So that could like I found that easier and better because I can sort of work on my own time as well. And there's not really like a self-study sort of situation where like you get like monitored in certain like environments and get told to work and stuff like that. I'm more better at my own terms.
Mm,
So I found that a lot more easier. And yes, you can have dissertations being observed because that's what needs to happen and
mm,
make sure that you don't really get plagiarized and stuff like that. And the same with exams. That case it is like the obvious sort of thing, but there is a massive difference between them as well. And there's no bells or there's no things like that in uni, honestly. But yeah, I found it a lot more easier. So yeah,
yeah. Totally different environments give totally different results. So
definitely. Um, Thank you for doing this with me. It's been
you're
really
welcome.
interesting.
Good, good. Thank you.
So if anybody has any questions, they can leave it in the comments, or if they want it more private, they can go onto my Instagram and directly message me, or message me, well, email me on helpvision216@gmail.com. And yeah, and we'll put some useful links as well for what we've spoke about today. As well. And yeah, so
Sounds
what's
good.
can you mention your contact details again,
Yeah,
please?
if people want to get in touch with me or they want to look at some of our free anxiety resources, you can find me at escapeanxietynow.com or newcastle-hypnotherapy.com, depending which suits you best. And we've also got a YouTube channel, Escape Anxiety Now, with loads of little videos and things that can help you to take your anxiety down.
Great, thank you. And yeah, thank you everyone for listening and um there again, do message me if you have any questions or opinions about anything as well. I like hearing about different things and it builds my knowledge up as well. So that'll be great. Anyways, thank you all for listening and I'll see you all later.